Great. Okay. We'll make a start. So, welcome to this seminar. This Department of Educational Research seminar. It's great to see so many people here and a great mixture of people. Some of whom I know, some of whom I don't. I'm Paul Ashwin, and I'm head of Department of Educational Research, and also I'm involved in the project that Jan McArthur and Kayleigh Rosewell we'll talk about, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But just to say that this seminar is being live streamed. So there are a number of different people, some of whom are members of staff in the department, some are students, and others are people from outside the department who are interested in the topic of the seminar. It's important that you know that the seminar is being recorded. So if towards the end of the seminar, when we move to discussion, you ask a question, then just be aware that will be recorded. During the seminar, please use the chat function to make comments and raise questions. And then when we move to the discussion part of the seminar, I'll initially use the chat to ask people to ask their question. And then you can also use the raise your hand function to also indicate that you'd like to ask a question, and you can find that under the reactions image at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So I'm delighted to be introducing Jan and Kayleigh to talk about the seminar. This comes from a project that I lead that's part of the Centre for Global Higher Education, which is an ESRC and Research England funded research centre based at the University of Oxford and led by Simon Margeson, and which is a partnership of 10 universities from around the world, and Lancaster is a significant partner in that, and we're delighted to be involved. So I'd now like to ask Jan and Kayleigh to give their presentation. They'll present for around 45 minutes, and then we'll move to discussion. Please, during the presentation, keep your camera turned off and your microphone muted. And then when you come to ask a question, if you'd like to, then you can turn on your camera and unmute yourself. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm delighted to hand over. I think Jan's going to start us off.
So welcome everyone to this. As Paul said, he leads a project within CG, and within that project we have different groups. So Kayleigh and I are here representing what's called the Society Group, and we'll explain more about that soon. So we're presenting today, but this is also work we've done with our colleagues, Mags Blackie at Stellenbosch and Nicole Peterson at Virginia Tech, and I think Nicole is here today. So you can see there on the right-hand side, the whole project team from the initial project, which was Understanding Knowledge, Curriculum and Student Agency. This was a longitudinal and comparative 4-year study of chemistry and chemical engineering undergraduates in England, the US and South Africa. And we're now in a second phase called Graduate Experiences of Employability and Knowledge, where we're continuing to follow a good number of these students. And in the end, we'll have 8 years of longitudinal data. So it's an incredibly exciting project to be part of. I'm going to borrow an anecdote from Paul Ashwin. I don't think he'll mind. When this project was set up and we were thinking about which disciplines to focus on, the decision to look at chemistry and chemical engineering was because in Biglan's famous terms of pure, applied, soft, hard disciplines, he also distinguished life and non-life disciplines. And chemistry and chemical engineering fell in that non-life category. And maybe that's why, but for some reason, they were relatively under-researched in terms of aspects of engagement with knowledge, teaching, learning, and assessment among undergraduates. But when Paul went off and talked to some people in these departments to ask if they'd be interested in being part of the project, and explained in passing, well, you know, we're doing this, these are non-life disciplines, the chemists and chemical engineers threw up their arms in horror because, of course, as shown here in the periodic table, for them, all life on Earth is contained in that periodic table that's the foundation of chemistry. So very early on, we started having to rethink some common assumptions about these disciplines, which is why we've called this talk today Insights from Unexpected Disciplines, because we're going to be talking a lot about social justice. And people tend to think, oh yeah, that's what happens in departments of politics and sociology. But you know, it's not happening there in chemical engineering. But of course, if, as the chemists tell us, and they're quite right, their work is fundamental to life on Earth, then of course they really are at the heart, or should be at the heart, of social justice. So we've also sort of got our informal title, which is Unexpected Insights from Unexpected Disciplines. And that's partly what we'll be sharing today. Kayleigh.
Thank you. So coming on to the methods for the project, we interviewed a larger number of students in the first year. We aimed for 20 students from each programme, and we interviewed 203 students in total. And of these, we selected a smaller number of students to follow throughout their degrees. Again, we aimed for 10 students from each programme and interviewed 113 students in the second year. Now, this number has, over the years increased, decreased, with some students not taking part in a particular interview. And we even had some students in the first year, reach out to me and ask if they could continue participating. So the number has slightly fluctuated each year. But we have followed those students regardless of their particular trajectory. For example, we've had students who have changed programs or moved institutions or had to retake a year, but we've followed them regardless. In addition to those interviews, we've also collected, other types of data. So we have examples of students' assessed work. We have video recordings of teaching sessions and interviews with those lecturers. And we've collected various types of documents, course, curriculum, institutional documents. And what we've done is really focus on generating this rich sense of what these programs are like, how they're designed, how students are brought into knowledge, and how students think about their course and university experience and their future. Next slide, please, Jan. So here I've just included our institutional pseudonyms, and actually coming up with these was quite challenging. The types of things that we were coming up with were just too revealing or just weren't culturally appropriate, and we kind of went back and forth on this for quite a while, until Mags came up with this brilliant suggestion of using chemical elements. So here we have our two universities in England, Erbium and Europium. We have our two universities in South Africa, Sodium and Samarium. And we have our two universities in the US, Argon and Astatine. Next slide.
Okay, will I pick up here? So as you can see, there's an enormous amount of data produced in this whole project. And what we did at one of our face-to-face meetings, which was really important, having these, bringing everyone into one place, is we had done some initial looking at the data, and we started to generate the things that we were finding really interesting. And these sort of morphed into some different groups. So we have a group looking at study practices with a particular focus on agency, one looking at knowledge, personal projects, and then the group that Kayleigh and I are part of, and which we're talking about today, is the society group. A little bit later, we also had a curriculum group emerge, and I'm still hoping to develop an assessment group when I find the time. But each of these groups has people from different national contexts and a spread of disciplinary expertise, particularly from generic HE people like Kayleigh and myself, and those with backgrounds in chemistry or engineering. Most of us are members of at least 2 groups, so there's this lovely fluid movement of ideas between groups. We set ourselves the goal of generating individual journal articles from our groups, but really the really important goal, the common goal, is a co-authored book that's going to bring all the themes together. And that's where we're going to have a project meeting in July and begin work on that. And today's talk is very much the society group in the process of reflecting on what we have to contribute to that common goal. So the society group is a little different to the other groups. And one way is that we began with a very strong sort of normative belief in society and social justice. And we believe that it's important to be able to have some working definition of social justice. Otherwise, it just becomes some fluffy buzzword or feel-good term. So at my suggestion, we focused on this from Axel Honneth, who's a Frankfurt School critical theorist. What is just is that which allows the individual member of our society to realise his or her own life objectives in cooperation with others and with the greatest possible autonomy. And that wonderful paradox of cooperation and autonomy is at the heart of Frankfurt School critical theory, and we've used that to inform this project. It obviously is something I'd worked on before the project, and we had long talks, the 4 of us, as to whether we were all comfortable with this perspective and what the implications were. But we found it really useful as a sort of a theoretical foundation for what we've done. And with, I'm sorry, that's missed something. My slides are, oh dear. Okay, it doesn't really matter. I missed. So there's meant to be some text and it's not showing, saying that Honneth divides this sense of social justice into an individual realm, a realm of respect and rights, and a realm of esteem, which is about people being able to do things that demonstrate the particular individual dispositions and skills and knowledge they have to contribute to society. And this, oh, there we are, it's now showing up. And this is important because a person who does not look beyond their own well-being and consider broader social well-being is unable to realise their own individual well-being. So again, this is a paradox of critical theory, and this very much influenced our thinking. So we began to think about the students' experiences and these different sort of orientations or dimensions. So where they're thinking of themselves and their own learning, which is legitimate and important, where they move out to some slightly further away, but really not that distant realm that might be thinking of the profession and the discipline, or in another context, it might be thinking about family and community. And then them moving out finally to this sense of thinking about society as a whole. And so the society project had this idea of looking at different dimensions of the students' experiences to see whether we see that they're able over time to have this progression to a focus on self, to a focus on others in some group, and a focus on society, and that all these together are important for an individual's student's well-being as well as for social well-being. So we looked to different dimensions that just again came out of initial studying the data and where we thought we might get some useful insights. So the first one was reasons for studying, then their students' understanding of diversity, and then their perceptions of assessment. And I really like this image. It's something called the Kayleigh stone head, and you can't really see it here. But unlike a normal Janus head, this has 3 dimensions, it has 3 faces. And in a way, I think that's what we were doing in the society group. We were looking out in these 3 different ways and sort of moving around the data to see what we could find. So that's sort of a little sense of how we approached it, which I think was slightly different to the other projects. So I'm going to start, so we're going to go through these 3 dimensions. I'll talk about the first, then Kayleigh will come in for diversity, then I'll talk about assessment. So the first is reasons for studying, and I should say that this was led by our colleague Nicole Peterson, who I hope is here today. So what we wanted to do today is not really show you, look, here's the results we found. We more want to give you a sense of the unexpected and of the nuances in what we found in the data. So when we looked at the reasons for studying, which was a discrete part of the interview schedule, we generated these sort of different themes in a fairly traditional way, but then we started to try and think about them in terms of, again, this idea of self, others, society. And what we found was there were really interesting nuances in the data between the national contexts. So if I could share these quotes first, these are all from the US, and these would be things that reflect the idea, reasons for study, family. So Katia, all my family has got a college degree. All people in my family have received a college degree. So that's why she's going. Everyone in her family does it. Ken, it was the idea that your parents gave you. That's it. You go to college. Slightly different is Junie. It's because my parents, my dad didn't finish high school. My mum did, but she wasn't able to go to college because then she came here and she got married and basically their life started. And I see my dad working really, really, really hard just to make it in life, you know, to support the family. So there's a slightly different there. I think you can see the nice nuance coming through the data. But what these have in common is that family is the reason for going to university and studying these degrees. Now, if we look at the South African data, we see similar, we see resonances, but we see nuanced differences. So the first one, well, my mum would not allow it, first of all, and I'd be the only person in my family who didn't go for a degree. Mum is always talking about having job security. So that's really quite like what we see in the US data. But here's Naomi. I think it's something my parents pushed quite a bit. So that's, again, resonating. In this area, it's quite difficult to get a job without having some form of education. And also, I don't have any particular skills that would allow me not to go to university. Now, that last bit is just gorgeous, isn't that quote? You come to university because you don't have anything else to do. But I want to focus on that middle bit because this is just an illustrative quote, but it's very much showing something that was coming out of the South African data, which is a strong sense of the economic situation they were in and the need to get a job because of particular issues of opportunities in their areas. And then the last, it's not a quote, I couldn't find the original quote, but this was a summary that Thalia talked a lot about parents, grandparents and siblings, and her reason for wanting a degree was that they could do the things that they enjoyed doing. Now that really is one that starts to show the difference between the national context and the way in which this one code of family actually means different things between the different contexts. And it just to make a similar point, the idea of financial independence, when that came up in the US and English data, it was very often a personal sense of independence. But here we have this quote from Sodium University about being able to apply for certain jobs that comes with certain salary benefits, also personal accomplishment. First in the hand to have a degree. I think I'm doing it for more than just myself. I'm doing it for my parents and for my family. So again, this is indicative of what we found about going to university. And if we just look at this one little category of family, we see this difference that in all of the national contexts, there was to be a sense that they went to university because of their family. But in the South African, they're going for their family. And we found that a really interesting difference. So that was one of our unexpected findings. I just want to say one more thing that came out of this part of the work and is about the unexpected. And this is down to Kayleigh's brilliance, and particularly the fact that Kayleigh, in her role, is across all of the data. So when we were looking at why students went to university and thinking through this idea of self, others, society, typical of all the society work we did, we often didn't find what we were looking for. You know, we have to be upfront here. We didn't find this massive orientation to society coming through all the time. But when we were looking at why they came to university, Kayleigh said, you know what, we have another question about imagining 10 years on. I think we'll find different sorts of answers there. And indeed, that's exactly what we found. So here, these two quotes. Denise, in 10 years, hopefully sitting in a lab coat with glasses, hopefully with a decent job and getting somewhere. I would say changing the world, but that's probably a little bit high expectations, but you never know, do you? So, you know, that's fabulous. That's what we were hoping to find. We didn't really expect to find it, but there, in imagining 10 years on, Denise sort of has a freedom to think differently than she does when she's just thinking in the sort of here and now or the immediate future. And the same with Lawrence. I would like to maybe do charity work or maybe run a small give back to the community in some way. My mum's a school governor, so something like that maybe. I think, yes, in 10 years' time, I'd like to be chartered and I'd like to be a respected chemical engineer. So there's two interesting things there. Again, Lawrence is thinking about society when he imagines 10 years on, because in that imagination, he's not sort of worrying about the financial stuff and the job and the mortgage in the same way. But also it's like he doesn't just want to be an engineer, he wants to be a respected engineer. And that didn't come through when these participants were talking earlier on. And then just to include, oh, I don't know what's happening with my slides, people. I do apologise. So finally, down here, in 10 years' time, I want to be producing albums, probably winning awards for the best produced album, playing music live, yes, mostly studio and playing live music. And I've just included that again because when the participants are talking about their day-to-day experience, this sort of joy wasn't always coming through. So there was something really interesting methodologically about this question that was about imagining forward, and the data we got there was quite different. So that was Kayleigh's brainwave.
Thank you.
And if I could get my slide to work. Okay.
Okay, so it's moving slightly different for me. I don't know if everyone else can see something that I can't.
Oh,
there we go. I'm there now.
Is that the right one?
That's the correct slide. Thank you. Okay. So in the context of diversity then, what we're currently doing is looking at all of the different ways in which students talk about diversity generally. And what we have are these planned discussions of diversity where students respond to direct questions. But then what we also have are these unplanned discussions where students will talk about diversity in a more natural and spontaneous way, you know, without being asked any specific questions or without being prompted. And next slide, please, Jan. Okay, so the slide isn't moving for me, but I'm familiar with what's on them, so I'll just talk and hope everyone can see what I'm talking about.
I've got diversity planned, is that not right?
It has now moved, but it's just freezing from my end, but it's fine. I'm vaguely familiar with what's on this, so I'll just talk anyway.
And it's just to say it's also frozen in a similar way for me between the two slides. So I don't know whether it's worth unsharing it, Jan, and then resharing it.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks, Paul. Is that okay, Kayleigh? I'll just do that. Is that right for you now?
I think so. Yes, that is the correct slide. Thank you. Okay. So thinking about these planned discussions of diversity then, all students were asked about the diversity of their courses and how they felt about it in general. And diversity was talked about in different ways in response to these questions as something that just isn't important. It doesn't really have any impact on anything, and it isn't something that students really think about or consider until this interview where I ask them about it. Other students talk about diversity as something that's just nice. You know, it's nice to meet different people. It's nice that everyone on the course isn't the same, because otherwise it would probably be quite boring. Then we have these views that centre a bit more heavily on diversity being something important, you know, specifically for meeting different people, being exposed to different views and perspectives. And then we have this slightly interesting view where students will talk about diversity as unimportant, but say that actually what is important is that people are given equal opportunity. So there's this slightly odd relationship between, you know, kind of disconnecting diversity from equal opportunity. And across these different ways of talking, the engagement is often quite minimal, and regardless of the particular way in which a student will talk about diversity, there's no real sense as to, you know, who diversity matters for, in what kind of context is it important, or why it's important. And this view about equal opportunity, this was something that I was initially quite excited about. You know, it was that thing that we were hoping to find, you know, this connection to society and this social orientation. And in some ways it is, you know, these students do talk about the importance of equal opportunity, but it's just interesting that it's disconnected from diversity. The diversity aspect of this relationship is talked about as unimportant. And I think this raises a question about being asked specifically about diversity and an element of possibly trying to say the right kinds of things. If you can move to the next slide, please, Jan. Okay, I don't know if that has moved for everyone else. It hasn't for me, but oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Thank you. For other students then, there are still, of course, responses to direct questions, but there are these really nice unplanned discussions of diversity, which, you know, sort of happen throughout the interview in a more natural and spontaneous way. And whilst we see slightly similar accounts to those who only talk about it when specifically asked, but there is a much greater sense of engagement with diversity. And there's a real strong connection between how students talk about diversity when specifically asked, but when they talk about it naturally. And often there's a much clearer sense about, you know, who diversity is for, in what kind of context is it important, and why it matters. And also often more of a connection between diversity and how it actually relates to equality and inclusion. So often these students will talk about diversity for the betterment of individuals, but, you know, also for universities, for STEM courses, for the profession, the discipline and science and engineering knowledge, but society more widely. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight these different kinds of ways of talking about diversity. And, you know, I've included some quotations here from Dean and Donna, who are both from Birmingham University and both are studying chemistry. And what we see from Dean is a consistent way of talking about diversity across all of his interviews. You know, he only responds to diversity when specifically asked, and says that it's something positive, but really isn't sure, you know, why it's positive, who it's positive for, and really unsure about what kind of impact it really has. And when we look at Donna tends to talk about diversity in response to questions, but also throughout her interviews in response to other questions that are unrelated to diversity, or at least appear to be unrelated to diversity. you know, she talks about it in the context of the Royal Society of Chemistry and how important diversity is for the scientific field, for the profession, for the community, and for knowledge. She also talks about it as part of both her course and wider university experiences, and talks consistently about the lack of diversity as an injustice and how important diversity is for equal opportunity and inclusion, for bettering the lives of not only individuals who she sees as being marginalised, but also for scientific knowledge and for society more widely. You can move on to the next slide now.
Thanks, Kayleigh. So I want to go back to our three-faced head to sort of pick up the themes so far. So you can see when we looked at reasons for study, you know, what they hope to get out of their degree, we found one sort of data when we looked at where that question was asked specifically, and then we found a different sort of data that did start to get closer to what we were hoping for in terms of engagement with society when they imagined 10 years in the future. And then Kayleigh, in the same way, one sort of responses to concepts of diversity when directly asked, and another when we looked at the data. So in a sense, what this head is, we found what we were looking for, but not often where we were looking for it. And that's the theme, really, of the unexpected insights from the society group. And so the same is going to be the case with the assessment theme. And I suppose it's worth just emphasising at this point that what we did as a group is we looked at a lot of transcripts. We looked across both disciplines and across national contexts, and we looked over time. And we had to do that because to find the sorts of insights we were looking for, as I said, they weren't necessarily where we were looking. They were the other face was finding them looking in the other direction. So to our final theme of assessment, which has been published already, what we did here is we generated these orientations. These didn't come from the data. These came from our theoretical position of what, of the ways in which an undergraduate degree should offer opportunities for students to place themselves and their well-being in a social context. So we looked at the assessment part of the transcripts initially, and I should say these interviews were very long and very rich. The amount that Kayleigh got out of a single interview is just extraordinary. So there's a lot of data here, as we keep saying. So here we just looked at what it had been chunked as part of assessment, and we looked for this orientation to self. So assessment helps me to learn, orientation to discipline or profession. Assessment helps me for work, is for future work, and an orientation to society. Assessment is preparing me to make the world a better place. I should say that I also did some earlier analysis at the start of the project about student attitudes to assessment. And what came from there was a very, very strong sense of the role of assessment in learning. So that's important to bear in mind, because that was a really positive and useful outcome. Sorry, there we go. So in our look at the transcripts, we looked at 427 transcripts. That's the first 3 years in England and South Africa, and the first 2 years in the US, because they started at different times. So we found 303 transcripts where there was some sense of an orientation to self. So Rafia here sums this up very nicely. When I was in high school, I used to think that the purpose of an assessment was just to show the teachers that you can do it. Look, I'll get this mark. Since I've come to university, I've seen that it's about making the knowledge stronger in your head. I just love this quote. So you can see that when we say an orientation to self, this isn't a negative thing. This isn't about being self-obsessed. It's the perfectly legitimate thing that they might be associating assessment to their own learning. But in our next category, orientation to discipline I really didn't touch anything. In our next category, we had 108 transcripts where there was this orientation to discipline. And this was very much them talking about how assessment will help them to think or behave as a chemist or a chemical engineer, or what they imagined a chemical engineer or a chemist would be. That the assessment was vital preparation for going on to work in the profession. And this was the category that had the most change over time. So about a fifth of the transcripts had this orientation in first and second year, but that doubled in third year. Now, obviously, that's as they're getting closer to entering the profession, but also in our English sites, 3 of the 4 have a very big third year project, which we think influenced the orientation to discipline quite significantly. So the one we're really looking for, though, is the orientation to society. Can they see that link between doing an assessment and gaining something that's going to be socially useful and in that way also individually enriching? So we got 21 out of 427, and these are largely fleeting or tangential. So, and I hope this is a good example that you can have social justice driven research where you are hoping to find something, but you can still research in a robust way that you don't find what you're hoping to find. So I just want to talk a little bit more about these few that we found and then the implications for the broader society theme. Okay, so just as with the other 2 aspects we've talked about, the orientation to society was rarely there when they were directly asked the purpose of assessment. I think there was one. These were mainly in first year, which surprised us because, again, we had thought that this would be about a longitudinal development, as we saw with the orientation to profession. You know, we thought this should match that. There were more instances in South Africa, which didn't surprise us. But those in South Africa were not explicitly linked to issues of race or social justice, but were because at the time there was a huge water scarcity problem and the students were trying to address that. So, of course, even though it wasn't explicit, issues of water poverty are closely linked to race and social justice in South Africa. But what was also interesting is that students could have the same assignment, but make very different connections. So some would connect it to society and some wouldn't. So we also found that institutions do build a social and environmental sensibility into the curriculum, and this is reflected in assessment tasks. This was particularly strong in Chem Eng at Sumerian, but students rarely make this explicit connection when discussing their assessment and do so even less as their degree progresses. So just putting in a task that, say, is do an assignment on an environmentally sustainable travel system, the students won't necessarily make a connection between that and society. And this is despite what I mentioned earlier, that they have this strong, really positive, great association of assessment with learning. So these are not students who are talking about assessment purely in instrumental ways. They're really not doing that, but they're still not making these connections to society. What we then decided was that we wanted to understand why there were so few. We thought we could, but one way to do it was to look at the students where there were these fleeting or tangential connections to social justice when they talked about assessment, and to go back and read their whole transcripts. So we read all the years, all the whole transcript, to look to see if we could get a better sense of the student, whether they were making these connections between self, others, and society. So I'm just going to share 3 stories before we end. So Harrison's a bit of a character. It's a really lovely fact that I only know Harrison through transcripts, but he's such a a character and a person for me. Now, he became interesting to us in terms of the society project when he was talking about his third year project, where he was using aubergines to develop affordable medicines. And it's clear from Harrison's transcripts that this interest in drug design was there, part of the choices he made for university, and it's evident through all 3 years of the transcripts. So I'm just including this as something to sort of understand about Harrison. So in year 2, he says, I think I have very strong opinions about things and it can be sometimes polarizing. But when we look to year 3, we see so clearly what we were looking for in terms of a social orientation. And this is a lovely quote. Even if all I did with my life was contribute to a new hemorrhoid cream, I think the fact that I'd potentially be making a new medicine that is going to benefit someone else in some way is nice. And then we had, if you're preventing suffering with something that you can take with a glass of water, it's pretty cool. If I contribute to some kind of medicine that even is only used for a year, it's not necessarily about my name being remembered, but more the fact that I've contributed to society in some way and made my existence significant in some way. Now, Harrison here is like the poster student for what the society group were wanting to see in terms of connections between what they did as assessment tasks, the sense of achievement, and society. But there's an interesting thing about Harrison where all this, even though it's evident over all 3 years, it flourishes, as you can see in these quotes that come out in year 3. Now, what happened is that Harrison came into the program with an interest in drug design, but it was never really nurtured by assignments, but he tried to take opportunities where he could. You know, if there was any option, he would make the assignment go in this direction. Third year dissertation was obviously where there's going to be the strongest chance for this to flourish. But at this institution, because of workload issues, they have a set number of dissertation topics and they have a quota on those. And students, they try and give some choice, but in the end, students are allocated, the main driver being ensuring the equal workload of all the markers. So Harrison didn't get into the drug design dissertation project. He got into something else of which he had absolutely no interest. And it was only because someone dropped out and then there was some sort of administrative error or something happened, and he ended up by accident in the drug design one. And I think that's a really powerful lesson for those of us who design assessments, and trying to, of course, workload of markers is important, but we can't be using that as a way of stopping our students flourishing. And if you think back to those fabulous quotes, if Harrison hadn't have got by accident into the drug design dissertation, we might never have had these quotes to inspire us. So that's Harrison. So Scarlett from Sodium. Again, she's interested in medicinal chemistry. The link to her in the first run through looking at the assessment data was not really strong, but it was when she was reflecting back on why an assessment mattered, she said this: I want to do medicinal chemistry. It could take up to 20 years just to determine whether the thing that you made will help someone. But I think at the end of the day, figuring something out that could help cancer, that could help HIV, would mean a lot to the whole world. So that was our introduction to Scarlett in the society group. So then we looked at all of her transcripts, and we found in year 1 just this amazing desire to change the world came through over and over and over in the transcripts. If I want to go into research, and if I want to change the world, if I want to change a problem in South Africa, I will have to study, get my degree and go further on. I have always wanted to help people and try and save lives. I know that there is a lot of urban places in South Africa that don't have medical aid. If a lot of professionals and specialists work together there will be a solution to some of the problems that the whole world faces. So we were entranced by Scala. Second year, there's the occasional mention of medicinal chemistry, but it's in terms of lab work and not saving lives. Her career ambition is now to work for a recycling company. That could be linked to social justice, but that's not how Scala frames it. Chemistry is about problem solving, she tells us, but there's no longer any evidence in the transcript of any urgent or real social problems. And then third year, Scala tells us, I want to be able to walk out as a chemistry student that companies would like to hire. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a legitimate, that's a good aim, but that's all we can't find in the transcript. All that wonderful, I want to change the world from first year has gone. So next we have Mina at Samarium. Now, Nina is different because here we have a more constant pattern. So in first year, she's saying, what I enjoyed about this test was that it was looking at how engineers are making processes that help the population. I don't know if I'll work in chemical engineering industry in terms of chemical processing in plants, but I would like to do something that will help the greater South Africa in terms of putting something back. And then in year 2, you need to be conscious of your environmental impact, like the world around you. That's why I also enjoy it, because I feel like it's very topical to what's happening in the world. And in year 3, just the fact that we are engineers and we are finding solutions to problems that are happening every day in the world, that, you know, that's what makes her happy. And I hope to be helping people and that I can make an impact with what I've learned. So sorry, so that was Nina. So to summarize then, Harrison begins and continues with a social orientation, but it's only allowed to flourish through assessment in the 3rd year and only due to a procedural accident. Scarlett starts with a very strong social orientation, though it's only tangentially linked to assessment, but she appears to lose this along the way. And Nina has a consistent and strong social orientation. It's very much nurtured by the course framework and ethos at Samarium. But we could say, and not in a critical way, that the program is reinforced rather than been transformative. So Nina comes in with this view and she pretty much keeps it the whole way through. We don't actually see it change, which, as I say, is an observation, not a judgment. Okay, so just to conclude, we've just got a few points that we thought would be helpful to emphasize. And so the first is the myth of the easily identified progression through the undergraduate degree. Obviously, we're not talking about grades here. We're talking about an orientation, but still, this is also reflected in our study practices group where we were looking for examples of agency. We don't see it start low and then beautiful, nice, neat curve up to graduation. We found that we could identify national differences, but also without obscuring the commonalities and intersections. So again, this is about the nuance of the data when we looked at it comparatively. Institutional or program best intentions or policies mean little if they're not transferred into the day-to-day practices of learning, teaching and assessment. So engineering has an explicit commitment in terms of its social role. Institutions have these beautifully phrased graduate attributes, but if there's not a deliberate intention to embed them in the everyday practices of learning, teaching and assessment, they really are very hard to find. Diversity itself is something of an othering concept for some people rather than inclusion. So students would talk about, oh yes, there's Black people. So they would recognize them and recognize the diversity, but in a sense that was really counter to inclusion. Student motivations and aspirations are contextual and temporal. Simply having an assessment on a social problem does not nurture a social orientation. And undergraduate experiences are not easily categorised, but rather they're fluid and interconnecting. So we just want to leave with 4 sort of observations. One's methodological, the power of qualitative research, but also the messiness and nuance, that sometimes we found the richest data not in the expected places. Interpersonal, that within the broader project and then within the smaller society team, there was a great deal of trust and safety that allowed ideas to be shared and tested. We could float ideas and we could also let them crash. And, you know, there was no harm, no embarrassment. An idea seemed good, then we decided it wasn't. So that trust and safety was very important, and we want to mention it. There's an institutional lesson about the mismatch between institutional mission statements, generic attributes and approaches to teaching, learning and assessment. We were looking for this social orientation from our own very particular perspective, but one could argue that most mission statements and generic attribute statements include something like this, and yet there's a mismatch in terms of what actually happens. And then that's strongly linked to our last point, which I really don't know what happened to everyone. Can you see me again? The slides have gone.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay, so I'm sorry, everyone. There's a gremlin in my computer. The last point was a temporal one, to say that one of the problems on these degrees is that they are so jam-packed. And if you're talking about something like a social orientation, if you're talking about making connections that aren't obvious, these students, they do one assignment and it might be a beautiful assignment on water poverty, but they're straight into the next thing, and it's really quite demanding. So that was our final point, that there is this temporal dimension to affect the ability to develop this social orientation. So is that us, Kayleigh?
Yeah, there's actually just one thing that I would like to say, and I didn't want to interrupt you, but it was just on the point of Harrison. You know, he's very interesting from the perspective of diversity as well, and I think we really see this orientation to society in how he talks about diversity. But again, there's just something interesting about the diversity aspect, because, you know, whilst he talks often about his own privilege and how, you know, he by nature will not experience, you know, racism or discrimination as a white male. And he often talks about how important it is for people to have equal opportunity. But in the same discussion, we'll then talk about how important natural diversity is, you know, that it doesn't matter if all women like social sciences, that's absolutely fine. And it's fine if all men are on the course, because that's how it naturally should be. You know, I just think there's this interesting, you know, the sentiment is there that these students want to see equality, but I'm not quite sure if the understanding of diversity and how it relates to equality and inclusion is there.
Great. Thanks to both of you for that kind of really engaging and really enlightening presentation. I think you've given a really rich insight into how, if university is going to make claims about how they prepare their students to engage positively with society, that needs to be central to their curriculum design if it's going to have any chance of succeeding, rather than something that can just be kind of assumed from kind of an existing traditional curriculum. So thanks for that. That was great. A bit like that, despite my repeated call for questions in the chat, that similarly didn't have the effect I was looking for. A bit like not having curriculum design, so then maybe I need to rethink the design of how I ask people to ask questions. But does someone want to raise their hand and share a question or a comment about Jan and Kayleigh's presentation? So in the chat, Sue, do you want to ask that question, or do you want me to ask it? Okay, I'll take your silence as me asking it. So in the chat, Sue said, in relation to diversity, the point about the othering of other students is really interesting. Do you have any ideas why this was occurring? Kayleigh?
Yeah, so this othering aspect, it is really interesting, and often you see it come through where students recognise that it's about recognising that their own privilege and that they themselves might not experience, things like discrimination, and racism or issues around, gender inequality. And it's this thing about diversity where it's often seen as someone else's problem to deal with it. And you see it often when if a student, for example, will talk about diversity as the responsibility of the university, you often see it being pushed towards it's the university to ensure that there's equal opportunity. It's the department's job to make sure that people are getting on this course because they're the right people. And I think Harrison is a really, good example of this, consistently talking about the fact that he doesn't have to think about diversity because he's white. And interestingly, that there's a number of other students from European university that do this, that they say that, well, I understand that diversity is important, and I understand that people should be given equal opportunity, but I don't have to think about it because I'm white or I'm male or I'm not foreign. So it's this idea that it affects other people rather than themselves.
Great. Thanks, Kayleigh. We now have a question from Richard. Richard, do you want to ask that, or would you like me to? Why has everyone gone shy today? Okay, Richard would like me to ask the question. So Rich had a question about the kind of methodology of the project and having the ability and the flexibility to take a step back and re-engage with the data from new and different and fresh angles. And he says that often research is seen as something very pre-planned and there's not enough time to do this. So he's asking how you manage this, and also how, how did you agree to do it in the project team? I've completely garbled that, so that serves you right, Richard, for not asking yourself, but hopefully you made enough sense of it to be able to answer it.
I'll come in there. I think it does get back to that last point about this has been an incredibly positive team to be part of, both the larger team and then the smaller sort of subgroups. And not just the society one. I mean, I'm in the study practices, and that's been the same, and Kayleigh's in other ones too. So I think it's because we didn't, even though we began with certain ideals, we didn't begin with any fixed sense of how we would work with this enormous amount of data, that we were quite flexible and that we would try different approaches. And that was the strength of having the different sub-teams, because different groups of people talking would solve problems in one way, and then you might have a mix of another group that's some of those same people, some different, and we would have a mix, and then we would regularly come together and share these ideas, and people would pick them up and maybe try them elsewhere. And in the society team, it was just simply wanting to find out more. We were intrigued, and so we decided to approach it differently. And it's really only now, and it's really only preparing for this seminar, looking back and preparing, for how we can contribute to the book, that we found this recurring theme, that what we were finding was we were finding it differently in different places. So, and then that was the richness coming through. So how we did it, we were just a really nice bunch of people to work with, and clever folk.
Anything you'd like to add, Kayleigh?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that maybe this is just you know, a lucky experience. But yeah, I think a lot of it is to do with just being part of a really supportive, you know, group. And I think credit should go to Paul that what he's allowed us to do is really develop our interests and what really excites us in this project. And I think, you know, the fact that we've been given that opportunity, you know, makes it a relatively easier process, you know, to really engage with the data, because I think we're all really excited and interested in what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think that commitment to following the data where it takes you, you know, clearly we put structures on it, clearly we've asked the students particular questions, but actually allowing the data to tell you, no, you're completely wrong about that. You know, that, if you're going to generate data, if you don't let it do that, then why have you wasted those students' time? So I think that's great. Something, you know, that occurred to me, particularly around the diversity stuff. I was recently reading a Gert Biester piece on different conceptions of building and how that might, you know, so self-formation, how that might work. And he makes the strong argument that focusing on difference is much more important than focusing on diversity. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about how you got these kind of almost kind of fixed views of diversity, and whether you think had you talked to them in terms of difference and how they understand difference, you know, whether that might have been similar, because it's simply the interview process encouraging them to say the thing they're supposed to say. You know, we all want to present ourselves as competent agents, or whether you think there's something about the specific language of diversity that led to those kind of responses.
Yeah, and actually I think by using the term diversity, because, you know, it's something that they are exposed to. Not necessarily, you know, as something that's embedded into the curriculum, but students often talk about, you know, the fact that there is a session at the very start of the year that talks about diversity in STEM education, and often how important it is that, you know, we get women into this profession, because there's such a lack of women. And I think that students are so used to hearing this term diversity, and there's immediately the expected response that you're kind of supposed to give when you talk about diversity. And I think, you know, maybe if we use different terms, I think maybe there would have been an element of freedom for students to not be so trapped by this predefined meaning of diversity. And I think that's where we start to see it come through in other parts of the interview, where they just start to talk about, you know, how important it is to see different people, you know, in science. You know, there's some lovely quotations from students, particularly at Erbium studying chemistry. You know, one of the students talks about the fact that if you sort of trace back, you know, fantastic scientists, often you'll see somebody at the top, and everyone that follows, you know, we're all supervised by this person at the top, and how important it is to get difference into the scientific field. And I think that the concept of diversity sometimes is a bit trapping for students, that they can't express other aspects of it.
That's interesting, and I think, you know, a potential finding that's there is a sense of the lack of meaning of diversity. You know, yeah. Actually, it doesn't mean anything because they can't talk about it in a meaningful way. Great. So, as often happens around this time, the questions are beginning to hot up. So there's a question from John Taylor, and Brett's also got his hand up. So John, do you want to ask your question? Okay, I'll take that as a no. So John's asked about whether the students see themselves as members of the professional community and what that meant to them, and did they identify particular characteristics of being a chemist or a chemical engineer. And he noticed that one of the students referred to chartered status. I think that was in relation to engineering, and whether that was also important to others.
The chartered status the chartered status is interesting because that was him imagining 10 years on. So I'm not sure we saw it so much earlier. Yes, certainly in first year, there's a real desire to identify for some students, and they get excited by what, in today's language, although I've got a problem with this, we call authentic assessment, but they love doing things. There was a quote from someone saying, oh, we got to do it. It was just like being the lecturer, you know, and it's certainly at European, they had an amazing first year assignment where they got to do, really push the students, and they didn't have a lab script. So they were actually working free in a sense as they would in industry. There certainly are a lot of comments at times to, you know, this is like what it would be in industry, group work, you know, doing that. The engineers, I think, have a very strong sense of that. But the issue is, according to our colleagues in the project who are engineers and chemists, that sometimes these are what they imagine to be rather than what they are. You know, sometimes they are these stereotypes. And even 10 years forward, we had, who was it, who talked about, I want to be in a lab coat with glasses, you know, because that would be being a chemist.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually I think there's something interesting, you know, that I've certainly noticed with chemical engineering is that, you know, a number of students actually come into the discipline not really knowing what chemical engineering is. You know, they, for whatever reason that they've decided to study it, you know, when we talk about, you know, what is, you know, how do you imagine a chemical engineer, and you know, what's the discipline, how do you imagine your future? I mean, in the first couple of years, so many students would say, do you know what, I don't even really know what chemical engineering is. I don't really know what a chemical engineer does. You know, all I know is what I've been told so far, which is that you could essentially go and do anything. And I think that huge amount of variety in what they think they can do makes it quite difficult for them to develop a sense of professional identity, because they don't really know what that identity looks like. But in the context of diversity, what I've definitely seen is perhaps something a bit expected, is that often when they describe what they think a chemist or a chemical engineer will look like, they will say, well, I imagine them to be a male, because I'm so aware that there's, you know, such a lack of females in the profession. And certainly I can think of 2 female students who, as the years progress, they start to develop what looks like a very specific female professional identity, that the reason that they want to go into this profession is because they want to be a role model to other females. And it's so important as a female that I get to the profession and I start to contribute to the lack of women there.
Great. Brett.
Hi, thanks to both of you for a very interesting talk. The question is, it's got 2 parts. One is about a tension I sense in your methodology, which is we've got these very, very rich, I think I've heard so many synonyms for rich and deep and, so, you know, data sets. Okay, every interview was a gold mine, and you're trying to simplify into themes, and I've sensed that tension all the way through. Even at the very beginning, where this apparently simple theme of family turned out to have so many different meanings, you couldn't help but wonder whether that was really a theme at all, or several different ones. And then the sense that this is producing a narrative for an audience. So actually simplification can sometimes be good. So I'm wondering if your mission of framing this project through a social justice kind of lens, which often brings with it some sort of evangelizing, change-oriented kind of ethos, is encouraging you to try and simplify this narrative into something that has a mission to it, and whether you see this as a vehicle that you could use to intervene in the future in, you know, an actual chemical engineer disciplinary conversation to promote change, or will this project not serve that kind of agenda? Do you see how the 2 things I think are connected, simplification and audience?
Thanks, Brett, and thanks for not putting that in the chat. Jan or Kayleigh, who would like to kick us off?
Yeah, well, I wonder whether we might come back to you, Paul, in terms of the broader project. In terms of the society team, I don't think we are evangelizing. I know what you mean. I think that's why it's very important to say that we did not find what we hoped to find, but nor did we expect to find it. So, but we just confirmed a sense. Yes, there is a tension in terms of simplifying the data, but I think, again, that's why working across these different groups and the conversations between the groups is what's really helped here. And this idea that we haven't actually set out to find anything in particular, both in terms of the society group, but I think in the others. You know, we began with questions, but it was really about testing them out. We certainly do want this to hopefully inform change, but again, not in an evangelistic way, I hope. But so, for example, chemical engineering engineering degrees do have certain social commitments as part of the professional accreditation. And I suppose what we would say is we're just showing the difficulty. It's not criticizing these academics, because they're doing fabulous jobs, but there is a tension we've found between how busy the curriculum is and allowing students to make the connections, which are for the academics probably really clear and implicit. And in fact, when we shared a first draft of the assessment paper with an engineer, you know, they were very, no, this isn't right, because we do all of this. And of course, that was true. They do it all, but them saying it is not the same as the students hearing it. And I suppose we would like to just have those sort of conversations.
Yeah, and actually, just to sort of extend what you're saying, you know, from the perspective of the diversity stuff, you know, it's being talked about to some extent, but I just think what seems to be missing is just, you know, a deeper discussion about what the things mean, and, you know, what the connections are between things like diversity, equality and inclusion, because I think there's a sense of seeing them and recognizing it, but not really understanding what they mean and how these things connect. And it just seems that there's just a bit of space missing to really think about those things.
Can I also just pop in and say, I think the other thing that I see in the society, but also across all of the sub-projects, is that it is this insight into hearing what students say about their undergraduate experience. And I think that there's always a lot of assumptions about students. We're told that, you know, they're instrumental, they act like they want to be customers, this, that, and the other. They're only interested in marks. And actually, we've talked to quite a large number of students in different contexts, and some of them over many years. And it's far more complex. So even though when we say in the society, well, we didn't find this really deep embedded social orientation, we still found incredibly positive things from these students about caring about their learning, about, you know, caring about the application, about seeing, say, for example, assessment as a vehicle of learning and not just getting, you know, a grade point average. So there's a lot of positive things in here, which I think we would like to share in terms of the students talking. And, you know, some of those quotes about, you know, them caring about the world, they're just so, they just, you know, reaffirm your faith in what we're doing, I think. So, gosh, Brett, you've got me now. I'm evangelizing. I'll be quiet.
And I think, yeah, Brett's, you know, that tension between complexity and simplification, to me, is at the heart of making contributions to knowledge. You know, it's trying to hold that tension as long as you can, to look for patterns that help you simplify, but also then returning to the complexity of data and saying, is that really a pattern? You know, does that really work in the way we think it does? And whilst also kind of trying to, not say things that kind of are too easily dismissive of the degree programs that have given us access. So in a way, it's that you recognise that, as someone responsible for the overall project is great, because to me that's just what we should be doing. And sometimes it's too easy to simplify quickly, and what we try and do in the project is to kind of iterate between moments of simplification and moments of complexity, whilst keeping the two in a productive tension with each other.
There was a really nice example came actually from the study practices, where we were analysing the data in terms of senses of student agency, and we sort of got to a point where we could sort of see something, but we really couldn't make sense of it. And it goes back to Richard's point. So what we actually did is we went back and we looked at how we had conceptualized agency, and actually we felt that we'd made a mistake there. We'd conceptualized a very traditional sort of Archer way, and that actually, if we looked at the other ways of thinking about agency, they were much more helpful for the data. So, we would make those sorts of shifts, and I think that's been really helpful.
Great. Okay, we probably have time for one more question. Vesna, do you want to share your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. This was very interesting and very interesting discussion as well. Just now, in fact, as Jan was kind of reflecting on the data, somehow what strikes me and what also came through the quotes is this idea that we want to change the world. The students saying we want to change the world, we want to improve. This is really great if I can benefit developing some medicine and stuff like that. And somehow this was quite visible in their year one or at the beginning. But towards the end, there was some kind of I don't know, as they dive deeper into the discipline, do they lose sight of this society contribution? This orientation is a little bit weaker. That was just something that's really struck me. And can you just somehow reflect also through your data? Is this something that kind of happened commonly, as you could notice? Or I have to say that it feels a little bit that we need to do better if our students forget what it is that they're trying to do with their studies, and how they can actually change the world maybe later on. And does discipline makes them forget that or something? I don't know. So if you could just reflect a little bit also through your data, because maybe I don't know enough about the project, but in general, this was really interesting. So thank you.
Thanks, Jan?
Yeah, so yes, it's interesting because first off, as we said, we found these, sorry, that's my phone ringing. Sorry, everyone, this is just very unprofessional, but I can't actually get it. So anyway, so the senses of connection to society, when they came out, some of them were incredibly strong, and they were more in the early years. Our sense is that the degree gets so busy. It's just a lot to do in these. And of course, it's very difficult for, say, the three of us here. We're not chemists or chemical engineers, but we have some expertise in curriculum design to actually think through how you would do this differently in these disciplines. Certainly in terms of assessment, I could think through some different ways in which it could be done. And I think it just does get incredibly busy. It gets incredibly, this push to finish. So one of the things I think we have to be aware of is that it may not be that all the students lose it, but they may stop talking about it. And so and I wonder whether this is going to come out when we have this longitudinal data, because when they did that imagining 10 years on, it all came back for some students. So will it return? Is this something about, the pressure of the last couple of years of a degree? I'm not sure. But so I think that question is still very open. I think we do have to reflect on the fact that sometimes degrees are so full of content and performative, that all those beautiful overall mission statements and all of that get lost. People assume that just somehow breathing the air will turn out these good citizens, rather than thinking, actually, that's an issue of curriculum design.
Yeah. And I think something else, happens has happened in this project. I think as students progress through their degree, the pressure of getting a job really starts to take over, that panic that I'm finishing and I've paid all this money for a degree and it now needs to be worth it, and I need a job. And I think what also happens in our project is, for some students, their final year coincided with the start of the pandemic, and that really impacted on the jobs that were available, especially in chemistry. I mean, the amount of students that I've spoken to, that there's just limits on jobs in the scientific field, and they just, that pressure of not only getting a job, but then trying to get a job in a pandemic where there was so few jobs. I think just that pressure just became really intense for a lot of students.
Right. Thanks for that. I think that brings us to the end of the time for seminar. So thanks for that. I mean, just thinking about that final question, I think also for me it raises the issue of what links do universities have with society. So if you want your graduates to make a contribution, then actually you need to scaffold their engagement with society in a way that allows them to actually take their knowledge and their capabilities into society, rather than just saying, off you go into society and make a change. And the change they make is to become like everyone else before them. A bit like, very similar to what happens on initial teacher training courses in universities, where academics get introduced into innovative ways of teaching and go back into departments and teach like all of their colleagues. Anyway, so can we thank Jan and Kayleigh for a really excellent and engaging seminar. The quality was really shown by the engagement in the questions and the thoughtful questions. So thanks to everyone for that. The next online seminar will take place on Wednesday, the 16th of March, and will be presented by Ola Hosni from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. The title is Opening Windows and Closing Gaps, Egypt's Inclusion Policy Making Process in Higher Education Institutions. So I hope you can join us for that. A video of this seminar will be available on our YouTube channel soon, so you'll get to watch it all again. And finally, thanks again to Kayleigh and Jan for a really engaging seminar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.